How's it going?
We saw some heartbreak and tragedy this weekend. The numbers show that there is a rise in hate crimes in the United States. We know that white supremacist groups have existed in the United States. Talk to me about what you've learned about the modern incarnation of these movements.
Yeah, I think that the main thing that's different now between the kind of white supremacist organizing we saw in the 80s and 90s has to do with the ability for these movements to scale using internet and communication technologies. White supremacists using gaming culture in order to reach out to other young men and to get them to start to talk somewhat ironically about the problems they have with immigration or the problems they have with women. And then over time, we see these young men start to take what was jokes in the beginning more seriously as a way to participate in a larger political discussion.
Based on your research, to what do you credit this rise in these groups and in the hate crimes that we're seeing in this country right now?
So at the same time that we have social media that allows anyone to create their own networks and communities, we see different groups of people taking advantage of that ease of connectivity. And that technical connectivity is creating a situation where we see more and more networked harassment. We see more and more things like manifestos and calls to action circulating that do involve mass violence and do involve white supremacist talking points. The other part of it is that there's a political opportunity to be had here to talk about how politicians are framing the larger conversation about race in America, which is probably at a fever pitch we haven't seen since the 1960s. The main thing that I think our research is pointing us to is that young people, men especially, are becoming radicalized through participating in these groups, and they also believe that violence will change the political conversation nationally, which it does.
What should journalists, what should media, what should just the culture do to act responsibly in reaction to all of this?
I think it's important that journalists highly contextualize these moments by looking at what is in the manifesto and what your audience needs to know about that manifesto. It might not be the case that your audience needs to know all of these details. And so I recommend that journalists often try to paraphrase and use their own words to ensure that their audience has a full and in-depth understanding of what happened and the reasons why. The journalist shouldn't give over the power to the attacker and quote them directly, because that's one of the intentions of leaving behind a manifesto.
Knowing what you know, based on your research and based on so much of the historical context that you've been looking at, how would you characterize this moment that we're in right now?
Yeah, to be honest with you, this is it's a very difficult position for a researcher to be in, because we can derive as many insights as we can find in the data, and we can share them with as many people and stakeholders as we can. But ultimately, this problem is something that is only going to be tamped down through the cooperation of journalists, politicians, police, as well as platform companies, ensuring that the materials that white supremacists are using to recruit and retain and radicalize youth, we need to have much more stronger moderation practices online. Thinking here particularly about the way these acts of violence are meant to inspire the next wave of violence.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.